Okay, so let's start our colloquium today, and we are very happy to have Nabamita Banerjee from ISAR Bhopal, and she will talk about symmetries in physics. So welcome, Nabamita, and hand it over to start the talk.
Thanks a lot, Arpon. Actually, I must confess that this is the first ever colloquium of my life. So, so I tried to make it simple, and please stop me at any point, like if some issues are not clear. Okay, so and also like for experts, this can be really boring and trivial, so you may not listen. Okay, so let me begin. So today I want to talk about symmetries in physics, and as probably many of us will agree that symmetry really plays an extremely important role in our life. Everywhere, either we see symmetric objects. If we don't see symmetric objects, we try to understand why, where is it not symmetric, why is it not symmetric, and maybe it's fine even if it is not symmetric. So whatever, like let's try to understand, like if there is something more intrinsic to it, and if it is like just symmetry is more than what we just see by our eyes. Okay, so let's try to get to that. Okay, so so the first question that we will ask in the talk is, what is symmetry? Okay? And then I'll give you, take you to physics. Of course, this is a physics colloquium. So I'll then tell you like what is symmetry in physics and what kind of symmetries that we broadly talk about in physics. Then I'll tell you like in little bit more detail what are global and local symmetries and what is the consequence of these symmetries in various levels in physics, okay, at various energy length in physics. So finally, I'll talk about some quantities called scattering amplitudes in quantum field theory. So even if you don't know what is quantum field theory, what is a scattering amplitude, don't worry. I will try to introduce it in simple language. And then I'll talk about a particular statement of scattering amplitudes in certain quantum field theories, in particular to quantum electrodynamics. And finally, I will relate that nice structure of scattering amplitudes of quantum field theory to symmetry again. And then I'll try to tell you about some evidences that we can get for the particular relation that I'll be talking about, and then what are the open issues in the field. Okay, so that's the plan. Okay, so let's begin. So what is symmetry? Well, for in a layman's language, we can say that symmetry is what makes our surrounding beautiful. Right? So uh, that's what we can think of symmetry to be, or the effect of symmetry to be. So it originates from a Greek word, symmetria, that means agreement in dimensions, due proportions, and arrangement. And like I think these three words perfectly describes the notion of symmetry for a generic person. Okay, but now let us try to give a little bit more scientific definition of symmetry. Okay, so scientifically, we can think of symmetry to be certain set of transformations that will keep an object invariant. Okay, so an object can have a certain shape, and if we can move it or if we can transform it in some way so that even after the transformation, the object looks same, that I have performed certain operation on the object is not evident for an observer who is looking at the object. That's how scientifically we can think of the what symmetry is. Okay, and it is definitely present everywhere in nature, both in science and in arts, and in many cases the symmetry is broken also. Okay, so in today's talk I will try to touch upon on both the aspects, where symmetry is there and where symmetry is broken. Okay, so let me show you certain pictures of symmetric objects. So well, I have said symmetry in science and arts, but and also have given these pictures first, more scientific pictures, and then pictures from arts. But please, I mean, it is this particular thing is not symmetric. Okay, I have just written out of my thinking. So look at the first picture of the butterfly. We all have seen it. And of course, if you just think of placing a mirror in between, it's just like the reflection of one side is just the reflection of other. So it does have a symmetry in that sense. Then think of this starfish. These also, if I rotate it by this very particular angle, right, the starfish will look exactly same, although in actual, we actually have rotated the system. So this is also a symmetric object, symmetric biological object. This is just some arrangement of leaves that you can see around. I have actually just taken this picture from outside my office. So all these things, basically, they definitely look nice. They all look nice, and they are symmetric in the sense of symmetry that I just told you a few minutes back. Similarly, the symmetry actually also inspires our artists, right? So the Taj Mahal would not have been it would not have looked so beautiful if it was not symmetric. So that makes it beautiful. And this is art that where you can again see that it is symmetric, like the way these people are there in this drawing, they're perfectly symmetric. So it's the symmetry is definitely something that nature prefers and the artists like. Okay? They like to keep that, preserve that in their art. Okay. So in today's talk, what I shall be doing is we shall discuss this beauty of symmetry in physics. Okay, so let's go ahead. So let's begin. Okay? Here, first I'll talk about the old approach of theoretical physics. Okay? By that I mean like the first kind of theoretical physics that we have learned, even without probably calling it theoretical physics in our schools. Okay? This is more like, you can think of this is more like Newton or Maxwell era of physics. Okay, so how did we do physics? Basically, it was empirical. Okay? By that I mean we begin with certain laws, the Newton's laws of motion or Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism. You can think of either of it in the back of your mind. And these laws are, so we begin with certain laws or equations, okay, and solve various physical problems by using these laws. So we never actually asked a question that why is it correct? Why are these equations correct? Well, the applied them for our systems, it did give us right results. So experimentally, they are verified. Okay, for example, here I have talked about Newton's laws of motion. So we know that the motion, okay, by motion I mean how a particle, suppose a particle of mass m is moving in time. So what would be its trajectory with respect to time is, according to Newton's law, is given by this equation, that there should be some force which will cause this motion. And in particular, the equation that is going to govern this is the applied force is equal to mass times the acceleration. Okay? So that's the law. We all have used it. Then we have, I mean, in our mechanics course, we all have used it. Then we have considered certain particular form of the applied force and found trajectories of particles. Okay? So of course, this approach is successful and is experimentally verified. And if you remember, is the screen okay? Is it visible?
Yes, yes.
So these laws also gives us certain conserved quantities. Okay? And those conserved quantities really helps us when we solve problems. Okay, so these conserved I'm sorry.
No, it's zoom out now. So you can zoom out a little bit. It's zoomed in actually.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do that. Oh, just a second. Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay, I'll start sharing again. Just give me 1 second. Sorry for the glitch. So my screen is not shared, right? Is that correct?
No, it's not shared. Yes.
Just give me a second. Just a second. Is it shared?
Ah,
But
shared.
it is probably not full screen, right?
Probably.
Yeah. It is not full screen.
No.
So I'll just stop sharing
Ah.
and again share. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we were here. Okay. So what we have seen that this
The screen is not shared actually.
oh. Is it shared now?
Actually.
But is it full screen?
It's not full screen, but I think it's okay. Means you can just scroll down. I think that should be fine. I think it's fine actually.
Okay. Something is wrong. I'm sorry. Okay, good. So, as I was saying that these laws basically gives us certain kinds of quantities and those are useful in solving problems. Now, the fact is that in Newtonian mechanics, we basically think of these conserved quantities as consequence of dynamical motions. And that's it. I mean, we basically, this is very useful for us if we have more and more conserved quantities in a mechanical system, because that helps us to solve the system completely. And we do not really ask for is there any fundamental reason behind getting these conserved quantities. So that's what is the Newtonian or the old approach of theoretical physics that we can think about. Okay. Now, when we basically then we can ask a question that is there something more fundamental? Okay, so can we think of using symmetry in more useful way? Okay, even in Newtonian physics, if we really think about it, the way we look for, we try to use symmetry is following, that we try to consider objects that has nicer symmetric shapes. Okay, for example, we try to solve problem for a spherical object or for a cylindrical object or for a perfectly nicely shaped parallelepiped or squares. This is simply because like even our coordinate system, the 3 coordinate system that I have tried to show you here are also symmetric in this sense, right? So we basically look for these symmetrical objects and then just use our usual laws and try to get results, or we try to understand their motions for them. Okay, but that's it. And in this way we cannot really make much of a progress. By that I mean, if we bring some new changes to our system, we don't know how to really work in the older framework and get the same results for these new systems again. We really have to again completely go back to the basic Newtonian framework or the Maxwellian framework and redo the entire calculation for a slightly modified object or for a slightly modified system. So that's a problem, because here this case the approach is more like that there is an equation given, use this equation and get the physics out of it. There is no governing fundamental principle that can help us to say like how to really go for a more systematic way to understand the dynamics of the system. Okay, so the question that we can ask at the beginning of, if we want to take a new approach to theoretical physics, is following. And that is, can we write down a more fundamental object Okay? That will give us these laws or the equations for motions. Okay? Is it possible? Can we do that? And if yes, would there be a guiding principle to write down such an fundamental object? That's these are certain questions that came to people's mind when they tried to think of a more basic way to get to the dynamics of various phenomena. And the answer turns out to be yes. Okay, and that you can think of as the beginning of a new approach to theoretical physics. Okay? So the fundamental object that one can really write appears in the context of classical mechanics, or you can go a little bit ahead and think of classical field theory. Okay? So I suppose like all the participants here are familiar with classical mechanics, right? So we know that in classical mechanics, what we start with is an action or a Lagrangian. Okay, basically we start with a Lagrangian, and then from the Lagrangian we construct an action. And then we say that the dynamics will be governed by an equation that we get by using principle of least action. That is, we just consider any variation of this quantity. So I have written down a Lagrangian for certain classical fields, phi. And in principle, the Lagrangian can also depend on the derivatives of phi. Here I have only written the first derivative for simplicity. So if I change these fields, these classical fields, or in the context of classical mechanics, it would just be the position variable. If you change that, then how would, under which change of these fields, of this configuration, field configuration, this action will be minimum or extremum. And that would give us the equations of motion for the fields. Okay? That's what we do. So here I have used this mu index. By this mu I basically mean this x mu basically stands for, I have used it for both time and the position vector. Okay, so this is the approach. You can think of this to be relatively modern approach to theoretical physics, where instead of directly writing down the equation, we write down a more fundamental object that we can call action, and get the equation of motion out of it by using the principle of least action. But the question remains same, right? So is there a guiding principle to write down such an action? How would we write down the action for a particular system? The answer is yes. Here, symmetry would be the guiding principle to write down this. Okay, so that's what we will try to do. Okay, so let's see how we can do that. In fact, this new approach was introduced by none other than Einstein in 1905. So it was a revolutionary approach to theoretical physics, and that we can say. So what he said is that instead of starting with dynamical laws, we will start with basic symmetry principles. And the dynamical laws will just be the outcome of the symmetry principles. Okay? So let's try to look at this flowchart. So what we will do now is we will start with certain symmetry principles. By that I mean that we will so if we are interested in writing down the dynamics for certain system, we will first try to understand that what are the basic symmetries for that system. So first we will take that, and then we will try to think of possible interactions that can be there in that system, which will respect these symmetries. So taking the symmetry principles and the possible interactions that are invariant, and that will not change that will not change by the symmetries. Putting these two things together, we can write down an action, the action that I just showed you a few minutes back. So we can write it down, and then from that action, again by using the least action principle, we can write the laws or the equations of motion for that particular system. Then finally, we need to use the appropriate boundary conditions. By boundary conditions, I mean that once you are having a dynamical equation and we want to solve them, we need to know that how the various quantities will behave as you will go larger and larger distance in space or larger and larger time. Okay? How would these various quantities behave? That is what is the physics information to this system. Okay? And putting that together from the laws, we can get all the physical phenomena. So this was Einstein's approach to theoretical physics. That instead of starting from the equation, which is this box, let us start with more fundamental symmetries of the system. And then that symmetry is going to guide us to the laws, to the equations of motions. And then finally, from those equations of motion, we can study the various physical phenomena that are possible because of various boundary conditions. Okay? So this is the new approach to theoretical physics you can think about. In fact, let's just take this approach and get back to this particular law that I have written here. Okay, here I told you that Newton's first law was that the motion of any particle is governed by this equation, that there should be a force that will cause the motion, and the motion would be just proportional to the acceleration of the particle. Okay, why it is the acceleration?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Can you go to the next slide where you give the Einsteinian approach of?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So as far as I know, in mid 1830s or around 1850s, Hamilton also suggested some action principle in theoretical physics.
Yes, yes.
So how Einstein approach is different from that approach?
Okay. So Hamiltonian approach or Lagrangian approach is this. Okay, that instead of starting from the equation, you start from a fundamental object called Lagrangian, and then from that Lagrangian you get the equation of motion. So you are right. So Hamilton or Lagrange, you can talk about both of them. Their principle starts from here. Okay, so let me go. Okay, just this picture is enough. Newton's idea starts from here, from the second box from the right hand side. Can you see my cursor?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. So Newton's approach starts from here. So he starts from the laws, then applies boundary condition and gets physical phenomena out of it. Lagrange or Hamiltonian goes one step back, and they say that instead of the law, let us start from the action, from where the equation of motion will follow by demanding principle of least action. Okay. Einstein's revolutionary idea was how to construct this action. What is the guiding principle to write this action down? Okay, shall we just write down anything? Or would there be only one possible action that will give us all the possible laws that we can get to? So that's where Einstein comes. So his idea was that the action that we would be writing, okay, so let us just go back. See, what is an action? An action is an integral over entire space and time that involves certain functions of the fields, okay, and their derivatives. Okay. In more, day-to-day language, we can think of that the information of various particles, like these fields are basically that would give us various particles. Now, what would be this Lagrangian that we can write? I mean, what would be the function of the fields that we should be writing here, such that we get the right equation of motion, which will give us the right physical phenomena that we are looking for? How would we possibly write it down? That is where Einstein's idea comes. He says that we will write down all those functions that are allowed by symmetry. For example, if we want to impose translation invariance, rotation invariance, boost invariance, or any other invariance that you want your system to have, or that you think your system has, would govern what function we will be writing. So that's where Einstein's input comes. Is this clear?
Okay, so you mean to say that we will not discriminate between any other one action from another, if both are symmetrically,
yes. Both are allowed by symmetry.
Both are allowed by symmetry.
Yes, exactly.
And then even after we choose such action, when we specify the boundary condition, the boundary condition should have the same symmetry principle, right?
The boundary condition this boundary condition will take you from one physical system to another physical system, right? I mean, two different physical phenomena.
Yeah, I understand. But I mean to say that, let's say if my system, I know that this system has some, let's say, translation invariance.
Yes.
So boundary condition should not break that, right?
No. Yes. I mean, if you say that at a particular, let's talk about velocity and time. Okay, if you say that at a particular time an object will have certain particular velocities, that's what I mean by boundary condition. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that clear? Okay, great. So that is how, I mean, see, the motion of a cart, I mean, a bullock cart, and the motion of a car, both are governed by the same equations. roughly speaking. Okay, but the boundary conditions would be different. Okay, so that's what I mean. Yeah. Okay, great. So I just wanted to say, like, how starting from symmetry we could have possibly thought of this equation. Okay, see, so if we insist on translational invariance, okay, then we know that the acceleration cannot depend on x, right? It has to depend on dx, the change in x, because that's what is translationally invariant. But you see, what appears in Maxwell's equation is not velocity. Like dx dt is velocity. That does not appear here. Instead, what appears is acceleration. And the reason is that it's not only translational invariance that is important. We basically want it to be invariant under Lorentz transformations, okay? Lorentz boost. Or if you do not know what Lorentz boost is, let's not get there. We want it to be invariant under the inertial frame transformation. Galilean transformation, you can think of that. Like if two frames are moving with respect to each other with constant velocities, we call them to be inertial frames. And this particular transformation is known as Galilean transformation. We definitely want the laws of physics, like the laws of motion, to be same irrespective of in which inertial frame the observer is. Okay. Now, this relation basically relates the x, the position vectors in two frames by a velocity, the velocity with respect to which one frame is moving with respect to the another frame, times v times the time t. Okay, so of course dx dt will then change, right, in the two frames. But if you look at acceleration, then that will not change. So of course we should be starting with acceleration when we are writing Newton's law. So that's the quantity that can appear on the right hand side. But that's the thing that is allowed by your symmetry. Similarly, you can also write down, although I will not be talking about it here, that what should be the left-hand side? What should the force look like if you have 2 point-like particles which are separated by certain distance? What can be the force? We all know that the force is nothing but it just goes as 1 over r square. But why it is 1 over r square? Okay? It is not 1 over r square because Newton told you that it is 1 over r square. No, I mean, it's actually symmetry that by using that, you can really get to that answer. Okay, and if any of you are interested, I can talk about that after the lecture. But all I'm trying to say is that both sides of these equations can actually be obtained just by demanding symmetry. Okay, good. So that was really a revolution. Okay. Now, so we understood that we are now from now on, from after 1905, after Einstein, we are going to follow this path because this is much more fundamental and tells us how to really proceed, how to really go for fundamental physical laws. Okay? So we will start with symmetries and then try to follow this path. Now, before I go ahead more and tell you like what would be, how to impose symmetries and what would be the consequences of various kind of symmetries, let me tell you what various kind of symmetries are there. Okay? So broadly, there are two different kinds of symmetry. One that we call continuous symmetry and one that we call discrete symmetry. So let me tell you what they are. A continuous symmetry means a continuous change in your system, such as by translation or by continuous rotation or by boost, such that under those kind of continuous transformations, your system is not changing. The physics is remaining same. If that's the symmetry of your system, we call that kind of symmetry to be continuous symmetry. So translational invariance, rotational invariance, boost invariance, these are all continuous symmetries. Okay? And there would be actually, I mean, we can think of two different kinds of continuous symmetries, global symmetries and local symmetries, and I'll define this for you in a few minutes. Okay. Now there is a little different kind of symmetry also, which are known as discrete symmetries. In fact, the few examples that I have shown you earlier, the butterfly or the starfish, or those particular, I mean, or Taj Mahal, let's take that. This does not have continuous symmetry. Okay? There is a non-continuous change in the system, such as reflection or rotation by particular angle. In particular, if you have a square, and then if you rotate it only by 90 degrees, it will remain invariant. For the starfish, it would be some different angle, some angle between 30 degree to 60 degree, probably in that example. Okay, that will leave that system invariant. Okay? So these are called discrete symmetries. So this is not continuous. It's not a continuous change in the system. Rather, it's a certain discontinuous change in the system, but such that even after that transformation, your physical system is same. So in physics, so reflection, rotation of squares by 90 degree, or I mean, if you know particle physics a bit more, then you probably have heard about charge conjugation symmetry or parity symmetry or time reversal symmetries. These are all discrete symmetries. The parity is probably a word that is even familiar with like people who doesn't really do particle physics. Okay, so it's a transformation that we all understand well. But these are discrete. That's what makes these two systems really different. I mean, these two different kind of symmetries really different. And both of these can actually also be of two kinds. One is a kind of a continuous or discrete symmetries that we will call space-time symmetry transformation. What do I mean by that? By that I mean that, let me just go back a bit. See, here I wrote these fields, they are functions of space and time, right? So if you can think of certain transformation, certain continuous or discrete transformation of your space-time. So my coordinates, my space-time coordinates are changing to some functions of the same coordinates. And as a result, the fields are also changing. These kind of transformations are called space-time symmetry transformations. Okay? So here, the fields are changing because you are changing the coordinate, because you are changing the basic space-time coordinates. So that's called space-time symmetry transformations. And another kind of possible symmetry transformations are internal symmetry transformations. So where, irrespective of, I mean, you are not even changing your space and time. The space and time is same, but you are only changing the field. Okay? So the change in field is just the property of the field, and it has nothing to do with the change of the argument of the space and time. Okay? So is it clear? Do you understand that these two are really different? Okay, in the first one, the field changes primarily because the space and time changes. And in the second one, irrespective of any, I mean, even if there is no change in the space and time, but the field still changes. Okay, so these are two different kind of transformations that we can think about for both these cases, either for continuous symmetry or for discrete symmetry. And what we will do in today's lecture is, I will not be talking about discrete symmetries, rather I will be only talking about continuous symmetries. So even if in today's talk I am talking about continuous symmetry, discrete symmetries plays a hugely important role in physics. Okay, and maybe like if you are interested, you can read more about it. But for today, let us just concentrate on the continuous symmetry. Okay. So now let me define the two different kind of continuous transformation that I just told you about, that there can be global and local continuous symmetry transformations. So what are they? Okay. Even without, I mean, I have not yet told you that what do I really mean by symmetry in a more precise form. What would be a more precise definition of symmetry that I will tell you in a few minutes. But before that, let me explain what do I mean by global transformations and local transformations. So global transformations is a set of transformation that is identical or same at every point. Okay? For example, here I have given an example for this particular theory. So you can look at this theory. I am trying to write down a theory for two fields, that one I have denoted by phi and one I have denoted by phi star. You can think of any I mean, for any real life system of two different bosons, let's say, two different kind of particles. And so for this system, let us consider these space-time transformations, where I'm changing every x by x plus certain fixed vector a. Okay, so this is translation. I'm making a continuous transformation at every space-time point. I'm making this transformation, but the transformation is same for all space-time points. That's what we mean by global transformation, that it is identical everywhere. Okay? And under these transformations, these fields, the fields are not actually transforming at all. So suppose this is one kind of transformation that I'm talking about. And you can check easily that if you put this in here, the action will remain invalid. Okay? The action will not change. Similarly, another internal global transformation for the same system that we can think about is following. That let's change this field by a particular phase. Okay? So I have just rotated these fields by this particular phase. So here lambda is also constant. So for at every space-time point, the fields are rotated by the same angle. Okay? So this is again another global transformation that you can think of. And both these are actually invariants, are actually symmetry for this action. Okay? I will define in few minutes in more detail what do I mean by symmetry. Okay, but let's at least we have understood that these are two examples of transformations where the transformation parameter, the quantity by which I am transforming A and lambda, are constants. Okay. Now let us think about a little different kind of transformations that I will call local transformations or gauge transformations. So these are a set of transformations that depends on the space-time point. Okay, what do I mean by this? So again, let us take this example. It's actually, it's almost the same one, but here I have added another part, this f mu nu part, and I have defined for you what f mu nu is. So now I have, earlier I only had two fields, two scalar fields, phi and phi star. Now I have one more scalar field, one more field. This is a vector field, mu, and with that mu, I am constructing this field strength, which is f mu. Okay? For this system, you can actually check that if you change phi and phi star and A by this particular relation, where I have again rotated phi and phi star by certain angle, but the angle is now space-time dependent. So depending on where we have this field phi or the field phi star, the rotation is changing. At every possible space-time point, the field can have different arbitrary rotations. Okay? So this is again asymmetric. But the difference of this case with the last case is here the symmetry transformation parameters were constant. They had the same value for all x, whereas here in this case the symmetry transformation parameter itself is a function of space. Okay? Both of these are possible, and both of the second one is what we call local transformation or the gauge transformations, and the first one is what we call global transformations. Okay? Is it clear? Please stop me at any point if it is not clear. Okay. So now let's understand that when would we call these two kind of transformations as symmetry of a system? Okay? When a transformation would be qualified to be called symmetry for a particular system. Okay? So we are going to define symmetry in physics. I already defined it on the very first page of my presentation, but now we will make that definition more precise. Okay, so consider a physical theory now of certain fields, phi i's. I mean, this phi can be anything. From the last two examples, it can just be these two scalar fields, phi and phi star, or it can also be that gauge field that I wrote earlier. Okay, so just consider any physical theory that has some bunch of fields, some bunch of physical fields in it. Now, if I change these fields by an arbitrary amount delta phi. So we are changing all these fields by arbitrary, we are making arbitrary changes to the fields. Then you can easily compute that the action will change by a relation of this sort. Okay? So the change in the action will always be proportional to a total derivative term, which can also be zero in certain cases, by the way, and then another piece where that will give us the equation of motion. Okay, so the delta phi is always proportional to a piece that will give you the equation of motion, and then there can be an additional total derivative. Okay, so the equation of motion for this system for all these phi's, I'm sorry, I should have put an I here, would be E of that particular phi I equal to 0. That will give you the equation of motion, which is same as the dynamical laws. Okay. Such a one that was given by Newton. The same thing that we are doing, but now from a more fundamental perspective. Okay. Now an infinitesimal transformation of phi by delta phi would be called symmetry if under this transformation the action does not change at all, or if it changes, it will only change by a total derivative. So what I'm trying to say is, not all arbitrary transformations will be a symmetry of your system. Only those transformations under which the action does not change at all, or even if it changes, it just changes by the integral of a total derivative. Only those transformations are what we call are the symmetries of our system. Okay. So is the definition clear? Okay, great. Okay, so you can, with this definition, you can actually go back and check that this particular transformation and these two transformations that I talked about are really symmetries for these two systems. Okay, good. So that is how we are going to define symmetry from now on. Now, let's go ahead and ask that what is the consequence of symmetry for classical physics? So far, we are only doing classical physics, right? I just said that we are doing classical mechanics or classical field theory. And
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, can I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Ma'am, you mentioned that as per Einstein, we need to know the symmetry principles of a system first, and for using that, we will construct the action. But in the previous slide, you explained that in order to understand what are the symmetries of a system, we need the action, and then from that, we actually verify that these are the symmetries of the theory.
No. That's not what I mean. I mean, okay, what I was trying to tell you here is, if I have certain symmetries, then what would be the consequence of that? Okay. Now, okay, very good question also. So in this slide, what I was trying to tell you is a generic mathematical formulation of symmetry. But in practice, when I will be writing down a action for a particular system, and if I want that system to have certain symmetries, then I will already write down the action maintaining that symmetry. Okay, and then what we would do is we would try to understand that what would be the consequence of that symmetry for your theory. So you were right. Here I was just trying to give you a generic principle, like which kind of transformations would we call to be a symmetry of a particular system. And once I understand that, then we can try to go ahead and ask the question that what would be the consequence of this kind of symmetries in a system. But in particular, I mean, I will also give you examples in a few minutes when we will be writing down a theory. And if we want that theory to have certain particular symmetries in it, to be invariant under certain symmetries, then we will write the action with that. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Hello?
Yes.
So when we say that the action is invariant under this transformation, is it the value of the action, or is it the form of action, or what remains unchanged?
No, see, the action is always a functional of phi, right? So as a functional of phi, its variation should either be 0 or it should be a total derivative as a functional of phi. Okay? Not for a particular phi. No. Is that your question? Did I answer you?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we want to understand that if we have, if we are successful in writing down an action with certain symmetries, then what would be the consequence of that symmetry? Okay? And this is where the German mathematician whose picture I have given here, played a hugely important role. In 1915, Amy Noether, who was actually a German mathematician, just out of her quest, proved two remarkable theorems, which are basically related to the consequence of continuous symmetries in a classical theory. My point, why I'm emphasizing the fact that he was a German mathematician here is for that when she was writing down these nice theorems, she didn't have any particular theory in her mind. Okay? She was just writing it down for a classical system governed by certain action, irrespective of any particular form of that action. And what she was considering is exactly what I have written down here. So she just considered certain action is phi and assumed that it has certain symmetry exactly in the way I have defined it here. And then she gave two extremely beautiful theorems that tells us that what are the consequences of such symmetries to our theory. And we call these two theorems as Noether's first theorem and Noether's second theorem. And I must say that these theorems have proved to be of great importance to this advancement of theoretical physics. Okay? I mean, these are like, you can say, like one of the path-breaking ideas in physics, coming from a mathematician. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let's try to understand this. So the theorem 1 is following. What she proved is that for a continuous symmetry of a theory, there always exists a current, J mu, that I'm denoting by J mu, which is divergenceless on shell. Okay, so what do I mean by that? By that I mean that whenever the field configurations are satisfying the equation of motion, for those field configurations, this current J mu, divergence of this current J mu is 0. Okay? And hence, of course, for an off-shell field configuration that does not satisfy equation of motion, del mu J mu should definitely have this particular form, right? Del mu J mu should definitely be proportional to the equations of motion, and then only on shell it will vanish. Okay, where this J mu is actually the current that I'm talking about is this combination of these two functions that I have just defined earlier. If you remember, I defined a theta and a k here. These are exactly the two functions that are going to give you a current, which will be so special. I mean, which is so special. You can prove it that on shell it is always divergence. That's a theorem, and can be proved actually very easily. Now, next step is once you have this current, you can go ahead and define a charge associated with this symmetry. The charge is defined as follows: that you just consider any space like hypersurface in your system, in your theory, and then integrate J, or rather the dual of J, on that space like hypersurface. In more common language, you can just take the zero component, the time-like component of J, and then integrate it over the spatial hypersurface. Okay, so this d cube x only consider the spatial part of your manifold, and you integrate the time component of J on that, and you can prove then easily that on shell, when your J mu is divergenceless, then this current is actually conserved. Okay, so the time derivative of this charge is 0 on shell. Okay, so these are Noether's first theorems, and that is all that a global symmetry really gives us for a classical theory. Okay, let me give you certain examples. So we all know about energy, momentum, angular momentum, or electric charge, right? From mechanics, forget about last 10 minutes of my talk. Just from mechanics, when we were studying Newtonian motion, we understood that there is a quantity called energy associated with a system, and that does not change with time. Similarly, momentum does not change with time. Similarly, for a system that also rotates, angular momentum does not change with time. In Maxwell systems, electric charge does not change with time. Right? We have seen all these things, and we thought that those are consequences of motion. But now we can see that that's not correct. Those are basically consequences for certain symmetries of my theory. In particular, energy comes from time translation symmetry, momentum comes from space translation symmetry, and angular momentum comes from rotational invariance. Similarly, electric charge comes from another interesting symmetry that I'm going to tell you next. Okay, so these are the conserved charges that are basically consequence of symmetries of your system. How beautiful. Okay, now let us go ahead and talk about local symmetry. Okay, so far I have said that for a global symmetry, I can definitely define a conserved charge, a current that is divergenceless on shell, and a conserved charge. Now, what if my symmetry is not global but local? Okay, and just to remind you, by local symmetry, I mean the symmetry transformation parameter now is a function of space and time. Okay, so let's consider this. Consider the following transformation for your field phi, but now we will take the field to be massless. Let's take a massless field and give it an arbitrary local transformation by certain functions lambda in this form. Okay, just look at the transformation. From here, it is clear that there is a term which is proportional to the derivative of lambda. right? And hence it is important when your lambda is not constant. Right? If lambda is constant, then this piece is 0. And we can think of that as the global symmetry transformation that we have just discussed a few minutes back. Now, if instead of the symmetry being global, if it is local, then Noether's second theorem tells us something even more interesting. And it tells us that for such a local symmetry, we have two currents. Okay? We have a J current that I have already talked about, and you can also construct another current that I'm naming it here as S, and the properties are following. Now, on shell, of course, J mu is divergenceless, as we have already seen, but the second current S mu itself is 0. Okay? The second current that we can associate with this system now is on shell identically vanishing. Okay? And moreover, we can definitely then write this, that del mu of J mu minus S mu would also be 0. And thus, your J mu would be related to S mu via a quantity, an antisymmetric two-rank tensor, K mu nu, by this relation, right? I hope it's clear, because if you take del mu J mu here now, then your del mu J mu would just simply be del mu S mu plus del nu of K mu nu, and that is 0 since K mu nu is antisymmetric. Okay, so the cusp of the second theorem of Noether is that when we have local symmetries, then there is this 2 form antisymmetric tensor, this 2 form or this antisymmetric tensor that is associated with your system. And now we can again define a conserved charge. We can again define a charge that will be conserved on shell for this system as the same quantity. We are just taking a space-like hypersurface and integrating J over it. And by this, we can see that on shell, this charge would just be related to K mu. And since K mu is since the relation between J mu and K mu involves a further derivative, so now this integral will even boil down to this, it will just go to the surface of delta sigma. I'm just using Stokes' theorem, nothing else. And that's what the expression would be. Okay, so what does this statement tell us? This statement tells us that this charge Q is on shell and only non-zero if this quantity K, which basically is coming because I have a local symmetry lambda, if that has a non-zero support on the boundary of this space-like hypersurface. Okay? So what I'm trying to say, let me reiterate. What I'm saying is, if you consider a local symmetry transformation for your system such that the transformation parameter has a non-trivial support on the boundary of the space-like hypersurface, then only we will have a non-trivial conserved charge associated to that system. Otherwise, this charge is identically 0. Okay? So that's the implication of, this kind of local symmetry transformations are called large gauge transformations. Okay? So it is little special. It is special because not only I am demanding that the transformation parameter is a local function of X, I am also demanding that lambda is non-zero on this particular hypersurface. Okay? You can think of a local transformation by a parameter, by a function lambda that is 0 when you are going to the boundary. Such transformations are called small gauge transformations. And for small gauge transformations, you actually have nothing. You don't get a charge associated with your system. It's just identically vanishing. It's just identically 0. But if you consider a large gauge transformation where the transformation parameter is non-trivial on the boundary of this space-like hypersurface, then your system again has a conserved charge. So that's the implication of local symmetry, or you can say that of large gauge symmetry in classical physics. Is this clear? Okay. So what we have learned is at classical level, there are conserved charges, and that's the consequence of symmetry. Okay, great. Now just let us take this example. So some of you asked me, if I say that the symmetry is the guiding principle of my theory, then should I should be writing the action already such that it is symmetric. Yes, you are right. And look at this expression. So I wanted to write down a theory which has Lorentz invariance, or you can say Poincare invariance, and that's guaranteed by this form. Okay, here these mu indices, they are summed over, and hence this has Poincare invariance. So here, so this is a theory of a vector field A mu, which is massless. So point 1 to be noted, it's a massless field. And then you can check easily that it has, other than your global translation and rotational invariance, it also has a local symmetry where the change in field is just given by del mu of any arbitrary function lambda x. Okay, this is known as gauge symmetry transformation. Okay. So when I wrote down this action, I did not have this symmetry in my mind. I just wrote it down based on Lorentz invariance, or you can say Poincare invariance. But this action also has this symmetry. So this is an additional symmetry, additional local symmetry that this action possesses. Okay? You can write down the equation of motion the way I have defined it for you. You can construct the J current, the S current, and the K to form for this system. And you see that you can, I mean, I took this example because I wanted to show you the exact form of K for this system. You just look at it that K is just proportional to lambda. Okay? And hence the charge that we have defined as lambda star, I mean, as star K on sigma, it can only be non-zero if this lambda is non-zero on sigma. Okay, so that's what I've written, that we can only get a non-trivial charge when lambda is non-zero on sigma, and that's what we call as large gauge transformation. So for all gauge transformations that allows the transformation parameter to be non-trivial on this boundary, it will give you an extra conserved charge for this system. This is not the, I hope you understand that this is not the electromagnetic charge. No, like we're talking about a charge which is associated with A. Okay, so yeah, that's good. So now, if you also take some other matter coupled to this system, for example, I mean, if you know, either you can take the scalar, the complex scalar field, the phi and phi star. So let me just go back, just to remind you of the system. Yeah, you can take this system. Okay, so I was just few minutes back talking about this. Now you can add this piece, these other matter fields to your F. Or you can, if you know quantum electrodynamics, you can add the fermion Lagrangian also with it. And then for that part also, you will have the corresponding current. And the two things together, this part, which is coming from the large gauge transformations and the usual gauge transformation, and the charge from the usual gauge transformation, with both of these together will give you the total conserved charge of this system. Okay? So again, notice that this part will only contribute when your lambda is non-trivial on the boundary of sigma, whereas this part is fine. I mean, if lambda is non-trivial just on sigma, then also this part will contribute, which is the matter, which is the charge that is coming from the matter current. I have just called it Q hard, and I mean, right now it's not important to understand why it is hard or why is the first part soft. Just think about it. I have just differentiated Q into two parts. One part, which is only non-trivial when the transformation parameter is non-trivial at the boundary of sigma. And that's what is the first part, and the other part is the second part. So this is going to be the total conserved charge for this system. Okay. So what is the Krask? The Krask is following that if you have a symmetry, a local symmetry for a classical theory, a continuous local symmetry will have this Q as the total charge. Okay. So good. How much time do I have?
It's already 5 actually, but but
so like how long? 10 more minutes?
Yeah, sure. You are interrupted. You take 15 minutes more. Actually.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. So now let us go to Let's go to modern theoretical physics. Okay. So far we were just talking about classical physics, and we know by now that classical physics is not enough. If we are going to smaller length scale, then quantum mechanics will be important, right? So we need to go to we need to take a leap, and from classical field theory we need to go to quantum field theory. So, and why is it important? So this is a formulation. Quantum field theory is a formulation that basically puts together quantum mechanics and special theory of relativity. And as I promised you, I'll just tell you how we construct it. So we basically start with a classical field theory and then promote the classical fields to operators. Next, we impose certain quantization conditions on them. And then we construct all the states. Okay, so we construct the entire Hilbert space that will have, that we will get from these operators. So we do that by first defining a vacuum that will be annihilated by all the annihilation operators, and then the creation operators will give you excited states that we are going to finally identify with physical particles. So physical observables that we will be measuring in any experiment are basically correlation functions of these operators. Okay? So that was like a 10-second crash course on quantum field theory, how to write a quantum field theory. And that's not our aim anyway in this talk. So what we want to understand is what is the consequence of symmetry that we just talked about in quantum field theory. Okay? We have understood the consequence of symmetry in the classical physics. So what is it for quantum physics? Okay, so I will again, this part would be a little bit informative because we cannot really do in more details, but I hope it would be enough. So again, the consequence of symmetry in quantum physics also can be thought of in two parts. So if a global symmetry continues to hold in the quantum theory also, then that means that the vacuum that I just talked about will remain invariant under this symmetry transformation. So vacuum will stay vacuum. It is not going to change. The current operators, you remember we just had a current that was conserved on shell. Now in the quantum theory, that current would be made an operator. That's what I'm calling the current operator. It will satisfy the following relation. So the correlation function of the current or of del mu j mu with any other operator will actually be zero only up to this contact times. Okay, so if the operator is sitting at the same point where I have inserted the current, then only this correlation function would be non-zero, else it is zero. In particular, if you just put identity here, you see that the correlation function of del mu j mu is zero. Okay? So if the symmetry is there, then the conservation of current that also translates to this particular relation in the quantum theory, and that's what we call is the word identity. This relation can actually be equivalently written in terms of the conserved charge. What it tells you is that the correlation function of the commutator of the conserved charge with the conserved charge operator with any other operators would be zero. Okay, in language, we can say it like this, that all the correlation functions will commute with the charge operator, and hence it will remain invariant under the symmetry transformation. Okay? So that's the consequence of a global symmetry if that continues to hold in the quantum theory. Okay. Now, what if it does not continue to hold? Okay, what if the symmetry is broken? Well, if the symmetry is broken in the quantum theory, there can be a very particular way of breakdown, which is still very useful in the corresponding theory. And that's following. So if a global symmetry is spontaneously broken, okay, it's again a name, and I'll tell you what do I mean by that. In the quantum theory, then the following happens. The first thing is the vacuum does not remain invariant under the transformation. Okay? So whatever I told you at the classical level is still valid. But now when you have made these fields, when you have made them operators, and then they are acting on the Hilbert space, they're giving you the Hilbert space by acting on the vacuum, then the vacuum does not remain in. So that's the first change in the QFT that you see for a symmetry that is spontaneously broken. Okay, so we quantize the theory around the chosen vacuum configuration, and there is no finite energy normalizable operator in your Hilbert space that can take you from one vacuum to its transformed one. Okay, so their energies are infinitely separated. So you will always work with one particular vacuum and do your quantum field theory around that. There is a word for it. This is called the super selection sector. By that I mean you are just choosing a vacuum, and then you are going to work. You are going to do your quantum. You are going to quantize your theory around that. So that's the consequence of spontaneously broken global symmetry. Now let us go ahead and see what would happen if the symmetry is local. Okay? So on the contrary, a local symmetry, like the large gauge symmetry that I just told you a few minutes back, if that is spontaneously, I mean, that is actually always spontaneously broken at quantum. You can check that the corresponding operator of the charge operator does not keep the vacuum invariant. Okay? So let me tell you the consequences one by one. First one is, even for this, the gauge field will remain massless even at quantum level. But the conserved charge operator Q acting on the vacuum will not now give you a new state with the soft gauge field insertion. Okay, so whatever you had earlier, whatever was your state earlier, now you will have a new state where you will have an extra soft gauge field inserted. Okay? Field or field operator. You can actually, it should, I mean, I should be saying that there is a soft gauge field operator insertion would be there. So these soft states are the Goldstone bosons of the quantum theory, and hence the vacuum to vacuum transition is possible and there is no superselection. This is very, very contradictory to the spontaneous breakdown of global symmetry. We have seen that when a global symmetry is spontaneously broken, you just choose a vacuum. And there is no way that you can go from one vacuum to the other vacuum remaining in that Hilbert space. It's not possible. But that's not the case when a local symmetry, when a large gauge symmetry is spontaneously broken. Since all these vacuums actually differ from one another only by soft gauge insertions, they all have same energy. Okay, so you can go from one to other, and the charge conservation is still satisfied. So this is a characteristic. This particular characteristic of large gauge symmetry actually has observational consequence that I'll tell you. Okay? So, okay, now very, very quickly. So let me just tell you about a very particular operator that is very interesting in quantum field. Okay? And these are called scattering amplitudes. And what is scattering? I mean, you can think of anything that you see around us is effect of scattering. Okay? For example, here I have just tried to show you something that suppose two particles are coming. Look at the incoming arrows. They have certain momenta, certain energy. They are colliding with each other. Something is happening, and then you see them going apart. Okay? Something else going apart. You can even think like if you are taking some ice blob, then and if you throw two ice blobs to each other, they will be broken, right? And you will see something else. So that's what is scattering. And we can actually explain it in the context. I mean, we can explain it in quantum field theory. The entire formula in the formulation of quantum field theory, we can explain. Okay, so in a QFT, the most interesting and challenging quantity is basically the scattering amplitudes, and it is nothing but again a correlation function for a very particular kind of an operator that I have denoted here by S. Okay, what exactly this is and how exactly one computes it is something that you can do in a particular QFT, but that's not important. Let's try to understand what symmetry is going to tell me about it. Okay? So as I said, it gives us a theoretical estimation of any scattering phenomena that you can perform in a laboratory. And if, as I was saying, if there is a symmetry like in your theory, then at the quantum level, then the charge conservation will hold for every operator and hence, of course, for your scattering matrix as well. So this relation would still be true. Okay, and this A has a very rich structure. It actually tells us a lot of stuff about it. Okay, so now, so the main goal in quantum field theory is basically to compute this A. And of course, I mean, I hope you have understood that that's not a very easy thing. Okay, but that's what the goal is. So we basically try to find all sort of methods so that this A can be computed. Okay? And any simplifications that one can bring for the computation of A is always welcome. Okay? So now let me tell you about a very, very interesting theorem that helps us to compute A, at least some particular kind of scattering. And that is given by Weinberg, and it's known as Weinberg-Soft theorems. So what it says is following, that in quantum field theory with a local symmetry, okay, so you first need to have a gauge symmetry in your theory, then only some particular scattering amplitudes actually splits. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you see I have written down a very schematic relation, but let me tell you what it means. So on the left-hand side, I have given, say, a higher point, say some, here I have written n plus n point amplitude. You can think of it, say 2 plus 2, 4 point amplitude. And that is related to a lower point amplitude by this relation with certain factors sitting here. But when is this true? You must have noticed that I have put a hat on the left-hand side and no hat on the right-hand side. This is to emphasize that this higher point amplitude is special, where these M particles, the M external particles, actually is, they are such that you can take their momentums to 0. Okay? And this relation is only true in that limit. Okay? So a higher point, so here A hat M plus N is a higher point scattering amplitude, where M number of external particles can go soft. I mean, it's just a word, which basically means that you can take their momenta to 0. And that is related to a smaller point amplitude where none of the particles are going soft. Okay, so there all the particles are hard by the timing that their momentas are not going to, all the components of the momenta is not going to 0 simultaneously. Now, at this level itself, you must have understood that why it is important to work in a gauge theory, because only in a gauge theory, we always have a massless particle that remains massless even in the quantum theory, right? And only for then you can take all 4 components of its momenta to 0. Because if all 4 components of momenta is 0 for a particle, for a field or for a state, then it must be massless. Otherwise, it's not possible. And here, these epsilon i's, they are just quantum numbers of this hard particle. So the grasp of this relation is one can compute a higher point amplitude involving certain number of soft particles in terms of a lower point amplitude where there is no soft. This is an amazing simplification and an amazing relation, right? And Weinberg, I mean, although I don't have time, but still I'll just say that when Weinberg proved this relation, he just said, I mean, in his paper, he said that he has written this theorem because the theorem exists. And he didn't really think of any other implication of it. I mean, he realized that this relation is true for a gauge invariant QFT amplitude, and he just wrote it, okay? Like a mathematician, I mean, who really doesn't care of why something is true. If it is true, it is true. Okay? But why I'm talking about this theorem here in today's talk? It's because, well, even symmetry dictates this relation. So the relation that Weinberg thought is just a consequence of his theory is not really. I mean, it is a consequence of the theory, but it is a consequence of the underlying symmetry of the theory. Okay? I have told you about large gauge symmetries and large gauge wide identities. So actually, you can prove that this particular relation that we call a soft theorem today is actually a consequence. I mean, it's actually the statement of the word identity of the corresponding large gauge symmetry of it. Okay. So this is really an extremely good result and exciting result, you can say. And it is true for, I mean, it has been explicitly proved for abelian gauge theory, non-abelian gauge theory, theory of gravity, and minimal supergravity. For all of them, this you can prove it. Okay? And this is also valid. Here, the example that I have shown you in the right-hand side, I have just showed that one particle is going soft, but you can actually prove it in the case when multiple external particles also can go soft. And even then, this is true. So this is true for all theories where the gauge symmetry exists, right? The U1 gauge theory, the non-abelian gauge theory, or gravity, where diffeomorphism is actually gauge symmetry. I didn't talk about it, but it's same. I mean, it's just a little bit, gauge theory involves spin one particle, gravity involves a spin two particles. But other than that, this particular aspect is identical in both of them. Okay, so that's the interesting consequence of a theory, that a relation in the scattering amplitude, I mean, among the scattering amplitudes, is also completely dictated by the symmetry. Okay, so it has to be so. It's not an accident that this is true. It has to be so because the theory had large gauge symmetry. That's amazing. Okay, so any possible evidence for it? So the question definitely comes that can we experimentally see any consequence of large gauge symmetry? The answer is yes. Okay, so I just told you that there is no super selection of vacuum for large gauge symmetry, right? In fact, all soft states are equally probable in a scattering process. So if that is true, then they must have evidence in the detector measurement. And in the context of gravity, this is correct. And one do expect that this to give us the gravitational memory, and it may be possibly found in LIGO or any other gravitational detectors that are performing experiments, right? Okay, so this is possible, quite possible, that the gravitational memory, which is actually a consequence of large diffeomorphism invariance of gravity, would actually be experimentally tested. Now, one small point to note here is that incorporation of a small cosmological constant effect to this would be important, simply because we know the world around us is not flat, right? We don't live in a space-time which is flat. We do have a very small positive cosmological constant. So what would be the effect of that cosmological constant on this would be important. And possibly, if we can understand the soft theorem and the large gauge word identities in presence of such a small cosmological constant, then that can also be tested in LIGO, okay, or in other detectors. Okay, so that's good and hopeful. Okay, so where do we stand today then? Okay, this is all good, but what is it that we should be looking for? So as I said, that symmetry really plays a important role in writing down a physical theory. Actually, modern particle physics is entirely standing on symmetry principles, and then how possibly some symmetry can be broken and what are those broken phases. So that's another discussion on symmetry that I didn't do today, and they are both continuous and discrete symmetries plays important role. Then in condensed matter, symmetry protected phase transitions is an active field of study, which also basically uses the same concept. Okay? In quantum field theories, refined and integrated versions of soft theorems are known. I mean, the soft theorem of Weinberg that I told you is only the fast approximation of a theorem, you can say. There are many other terms the higher point scattering amplitude can actually be related to the lower point scattering amplitude order by order in the momentum, in the soft momentum expansion. And those are called subleading or sub-subleading soft theorems. Those are also known by now. And it remains an open question to understand what is the basic symmetry origin. What are the symmetries whose word identities would be those subleading or sub-subleading soft theorems. And then soft theorems and their understanding for symmetry for non-flat quantum field theory is still an open issue. Okay, so that's actually brings me to the end of my talk. So I'll just end with the references. So the things that, the topics that I covered today can actually be found in all this. So you can take a look at it, or if you have any more questions, you can just ask me. So thank you for your time, and I'm sorry for overshooting. Thank you.
So thanks for the wonderful talk. And if anyone has any questions, please ask. Any questions?
Hi, Arpan, Akash here.
Yeah, you can ask. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I was wondering how this memory effect would affect this gravitational wave signal. What would be the observational consequences? How it would affect the signal that would be observed at LIGO?
Okay. Akash, I'm sorry, I'm really not an expert on that. Sorry, I won't be able to answer you, but this particular reference here, by Hastern and Levin, would probably be very useful. So what I meant is following, that since all these different vacuors, right, are all are soft vacuors. So in a scattering amplitude, we cannot distinguish between two processes where there is one soft graviton or if there is multiple soft graviton. So up to the level of my, energy level of my detector, that it can detect energies too, all possible soft amplitudes will really contribute to it. And hence there should definitely be a change. And that change is really related to this, to the soft factor of this soft theorem. What the memory is can actually be written in terms of the soft factor. Now, how exactly that will change the, what kind of modifications that will bring to the data, I don't know. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
But I suppose this paper is actually useful in that direction. Any other question? I saw a question somewhere, someone asked it, what do I mean by on-shell? So by onshore, I mean only for those specific configurations that satisfies equations of motion. Not so equation of motion is an equation involving the fields and these derivatives. You can solve it with a given boundary condition, and then we will get a particular configuration. Those configurations are called onshore.
Oh, okay. So any more questions? Okay, so if not, we thank Nabamita again for the talk. And yeah, thank you for the wonderful talk, and can conclude here.
Thank you. So I can disconnect?
You can disconnect, yes.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah. I will just edit this video, probably send you the link when they edit. Because I recorded it this gap also.
Yeah. I'm sorry for that. Yeah. Now my desktop is working.